My name is Kay Creasel. My pronouns are they, them, and she, her. I'm going to do a brief introduction. If you were here last week, I'm going to say the same thing, so this is the time to refresh your popcorn. So I attended Alverno College in Milwaukee. I was a very active member of the Rainbow Alliance on campus. When I first started, there were 4 of us, and all we did was watch the L Word. And by the time that I graduated, we were the largest, fastest growing, most active, and best fundraising group on campus. I volunteered at Milwaukee Pride Fest. I interned at the Milwaukee Gay Art Center, which was the only gay art center in the country at the time. I also interned at the Alliance School, which is an alternative high school for LGBTQIA2 kids who had been bullied out of their regular schools. I also attended seminary at Loyola University, New Orleans, and at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. All right, so we are here for non-binary. What is it? And how should I act around a non-binary person? At the bottom of the screen here, I have the non-binary flag, the yellow, white, violet, and black. Now, to begin, I'm going to review some of the slides from last week. I'm going to start off with these initialisms, AGAB, assigned gender at birth. This is what is on your birth certificate. Could be an F, an M, or an X if you're intersex. There's assigned female at birth. This is somebody who is born and has an F put on their birth certificate. There's assigned male at birth, which is when there's an M on the birth certificate, and then AXAB, assigned intersex at birth. Transgender is a person who is, their gender is different from what is on their birth certificate, different from their assigned gender at birth. Again, this is an adjective. You would not say a transgender. You would say a transgender person, a transgender man, a trans woman. Non-binary is under the transgender umbrella. A non-binary person is a person whose gender falls outside of or between the man-woman gender binary. You might have also heard of genderqueer or agender. This is all under the non-binary umbrella as well. Cisgender, that is a person whose gender matches their assigned gender at birth. It used to be that we would say transgender people and normal people. We didn't want to say normal anymore, so now it's transgender and cisgender. And I'm going to review briefly queer from last week. Queer is an adjective. That's a person whose gender and/or sexuality is not cis-heteronormative. Cis-heteronormativity is the treatment of heterosexuality and cisgender as the norm or as the default. Queer is also a movement or a field of study pertaining to LGBTQIA2 history, culture, and/or liberation. For example, queer theology or queer theory. Queer is also a verb, which is to shift a field of study, movement, and so on away from cis-heteronormativity. Okay, and I do want to clarify, there will be question and answer time at the end. Okay, so I have these umbrellas here. We have the large transgender umbrella, and underneath that, there are 2 smaller umbrellas. We have binary. This is someone who's transgender and they experience their gender on the gender binary. This would be transgender man, transgender woman. Man, woman, that's the binary. And then over here, we have the non-binary umbrella term. And there's a lot underneath here. This is a very incomplete list. There's genderqueer, gender fluid. These are people who experience their gender as something more fluid, something that changes over time, or something that's beyond explanation. There's demi-boy or demi-girl. That's someone who does perceive their gender to be sort of on the binary and sort of not on the binary. Like somebody who's a demi-boy would say, I am a boy and there's also more. Or I am a girl and that's not an adequate explanation for my gender. There's people who are bigender who experience having more than one gender at a time. There's agender, which is someone who says, I don't know what this gender stuff is. I don't experience it. I just am. And then there's many, many, many more. You might have seen this before. This is the gender unicorn. I did not make this. This is from the Trans Student Educational Resources. So here we have kind of a breakdown of gender and also sexuality. There's the gender identity. And what you could do if you have this, like you can find this online, you can just Google gender unicorn and you'll find this. There's a whole spectrum here. Is your gender identity somewhere between nothing and, like, let's say 0 and 100 for female or womanhood, or for man, or for other genders? So that's gender identity. That's what's up here. That's who you are inside. Then there's gender expression, and that's also a spectrum of femininity, masculinity, or something else entirely. That's how you dress. That's your makeup, your nails, piercings, hair, how you move in the world, how you speak, and so on. And speaking personally, I think that we're going to get to the point where feminine and masculine just aren't enough. There are many different femininities. There are many different masculinities. Like, for example, the femininity of Claire's at the mall and the femininity of Lane Bryant are two very, very different femininities. And I think that it's inadequate to use one term to describe all of them. But anyway, that's the gender expression. That's how you look. That's how you move through the world. That's how you work to be perceived by others. Then there's the sex assigned at birth, female, male, or intersex. That's what's on your birth certificate. And then we get down to the attraction. That's what you're physically attracted to. And this is also on a spectrum. It doesn't have to be yes or no. It could be, I'm mostly attracted to men, but Alanis Morissette really does it for me too, like that, for example. And then there's emotionally attracted to. Sometimes you might really like the idea of looking at someone, but you would never want to go on a date with them. In that case, you would be physically attracted to them, but not emotionally attracted to them. I know that this can be a little complicated. I really encourage you to find this image and review it yourself. It might be a good idea for you to maybe print it out and mark down where you are. And you could try tracking this over time to see if it changes. So I'm going to spring on you the gender robot test. I just put the Terminator on here because I thought it was funny. So the gender robot test. So let's say you were in some horrible accident or you had some horrible disease and we had to cut off your legs and replace them with robot legs. Would you still be you? Would your perception of your gender change? And then let's say, for example, this disease progressed or you were in another accident and we had to replace everything from your waist and below with robot parts. What would your gender be then? Would it change? And then let's say we keep going. If there's some horrible accident and now it's just your head and a robot body, what would your gender be then? Would it stay the same? Would it change? And then the last bit of the test is, let's say everything is horrible and we have to transfer your consciousness into a robot. Every physical part of you now is robot. What's your gender? Does it change? What is your gender when you don't have the body parts that you're used to going with it? This is usually a pretty big test of, are you really cisgender? Are you gender fluid? Do you have a gender? If it's not tied with your body anymore, what is it? Like if there's an F on your birth certificate, if you were born with a uterus and a vulva and you've identified as a woman this whole time, and if, for example, you had this gender robot test and you say, yeah, even with a robot body, I'm still a woman, then you're a cisgender woman. I hope I'm not giving too many existential crises right now. So for non-binary people, the two boxes of male and female, man and woman, feminine, masculine, they just don't fit. But then you have to ask, who built these boxes? Where did they come from? Who built them and why? Why do these exist? Why is it that when you go to Target and you look at the toy section, you see girls' toys and boys' toys? Now, in that example, it's because it's easier to sell that way, but we want to be more than what we're being sold. So I'm going to give some examples of non-binary genders. Now remember, non-binary is an umbrella term. There are many genders underneath non-binary. If somebody tells you I'm non-binary, there are usually many more details that they may or may not have figured out yet. And this is kind of an introduction to just tell you, please don't perceive me as on the gender binary. So here are some examples. Last week, I talked about Two-Spirit, which is specific to First Nations people. You might have heard of the Hijra in India. This is another gender that's specific to India. Now, I'm not going to talk about religion. This is a public library event. It's not religious. This is merely a historical, cultural reference. The eunuchs in the Bible, and I have the Bible passages here where they are mentioned in Isaiah, in Matthew, and in Acts. Eunuchs fulfill a very specific role in their culture. They're not men and they're not women. They can't own property. They can't get married. They can't go into the temple. They fulfill a non-binary gender role. They are not in the gender binary. Therefore, they are non-binary. I want to specify that I'm using that as an adjective. They are non-binary people. If you went back in time and talked to them and said, you're non-binary, they might say, no, I'm not. That term doesn't make sense. But to describe the role that they fulfill, it is a non-binary role. It used to be in the United States and a bit in the UK in the 19th and 20th centuries, invert was a term. If you're familiar with the book, The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall, she writes about being an invert. This was before we had LGBTQIA2 and all the initialisms. And this was before sexuality and gender were talked about as two distinct things. An invert was essentially anybody who was not cis heteronormative, somebody who is not heterosexual, someone who is not cisgender. All of these different concepts of sexuality and gender would just kind of blob together into this term called inverts. It wasn't that long ago that this term was common. Up until, I want to say the 50s or maybe the early 60s, this was the common term, invert. And then it became homophile. And then homophile and transsexual separated, and then the terms developed and developed and developed, and here we are. And then this, I recently began reading a book about menopause written by a non-binary person. People going through menopause in the United States and the UK from the Victorian era up until the feminist movement were talked about as though they weren't women anymore. And it's like, well, if they're not women, what are they? If you go back and you watch, there's an episode in the early Golden Girls series where Blanche goes through menopause and she talks about how she feels like she's not a woman anymore. Well, if she's not a woman anymore, what is she? So the way that menopause used to be talked about, the people going through menopause would be talked about was they're not women anymore, but they're not men. They fulfilled a non-binary role. They fell out of the woman-man binary. And then the feminist movement kind of shifted that over. And then can you think of any other roles that kind of fall out of the gender binary, people who don't really fit into the man or the woman box? Pronouns. I know this is kind of what a lot of people might have shown up for to try to understand this whole pronouns thing. You might have heard of the singular they, them as a gender pronoun. I'm wearing my they, them pin. That tends to be kind of the general term for non-binary people, to just say they, them. A lot of people who are in the non-binary and larger transgender community are kind of pushing for they, them to become the default pronoun for just a person you don't know. Because if you're talking about someone across the street who dropped their umbrella, you don't know. You don't know what their gender is. You have no idea. So they, them is kind of becoming a catch-all pronoun. There are neo-pronouns such as they, fem, ze, zir, and so on. There are many, many different neo-pronouns. I know this can take some practice to get used to. If somebody tells you my pronouns are ze, zir, it might help to write it down just so you remember, like, these are the pronouns. The first genderqueer person I ever met went by ze, them. And this was back in 2005. These have been around for a while. Some people have multiple pronouns. Now, at the beginning, I put they, them, and she, her. That's the long form version. And the short form version is to have he/they or she/they, they being a neopronoun. We don't really say preferred pronouns anymore. It's just pronouns. So if somebody says my pronouns are he, him, or you ask somebody, what are your pronouns? Like that is the kind of a general thing to say now. The term preferred pronouns are kind of a specific context. Like at the beginning of this presentation, I had they, them, and she, her. So my pronouns are they, them, she, her. But because I put them first, they, them are my preferred pronouns. And keep in mind that pronouns can kind of change depending on context. Like let's say you and a friend from church get together for lunch, and at lunch, your friend says, my pronouns are ze, them, but when we're at church, please use he, him. Kind of pay attention to that because some people aren't fully out or they don't want to be out in certain contexts. So in that example, what your friend tells you in private is what their preferred pronoun is, and then what they have in public is their pronoun. Something that you can do to help non-binary people is to have all your introductions and email signatures include your own personal pronouns. It can be the situation, especially in the case of work email signatures, where only the non-binary employee puts their pronouns and nobody else does. So right away, everybody's like, oh, they're the weirdo. If everybody has their pronouns in their email signature, it doesn't out anyone. It just is. It's general courtesy, and it can kind of help non-binary people feel less isolated and feel more validated. And keep in mind, pronouns are not always a reflection of gender identity or gender expression. There can be a non-binary person who's growing facial hair and is flat-chested and is built like Arnold Schwarzenegger, but prefers she, her pronouns. That's valid. There can be somebody who looks like David Bowie or Grace Jones and is totally androgynous and says my pronouns are she, her. That's totally valid. And people can choose different pronouns over time. They might like trying on different ones. Again, it can help if you just write it down as a personal note to yourself. General etiquette. First thing, don't assume. If somebody comes out to you as non-binary, don't assume that they are going to take hormone replacement therapy. Don't assume that they are never going to have kids. Don't assume that they are going to have kids. Don't assume that they're going to take some weird name that you've never heard of. And the inverse of that is if you see somebody whose gender expression is different from what you'd expect, don't assume their gender. Again, don't assume whether or not they're married. Don't assume whether or not they have a job. Don't assume whether or not they have kids. Part of the non-binary community is to just accept people where they are. And it's easier to accept people where they are when you don't look at them and think, this is who they are. I don't have to talk to them anymore. And on the other side of that, don't doubt. If somebody tells you, I want you to call me by Scout, and I want you to call me they, them, please say, thank you for telling me Scout. I will call you they, them from now on. Please don't say it's a phase. Here's the thing. We all go through one very important phase. Every single human being on Earth, maybe minus 3 people, we all go through one very important phase. Teething. Teething is a phase. Teething is a necessary part for human growth. If we don't go through the teething phase, we don't learn how to, we don't develop the tools necessary to eat and digest the food that we need to grow. When you're a kid or some niece or nephew or somebody in your kindergarten class is teething, you don't say it's just a phase. No, you listen to their pain, you listen to their growth, you help them go through it. It's valid. So even if it does happen to be a phase, even if somebody does come to you one day and say, I want you to use he, him pronouns for me, and then a month later they say, no, you don't have to use those pronouns for me anymore. Yeah, it was a phase. That doesn't mean it wasn't important. So another part to etiquette is please educate yourself. By being here, you are educating yourself. Thank you. Part of educating yourself is also to use various kinds of media, and that's fiction, nonfiction, That's nonfiction books, novels, poetry, podcasts, TV shows. It can be a lot easier to adjust to pronouns and names and gender concepts when you surround yourself by them in the books that you read and in the shows that you watch. This is a great way to educate yourself. And that way, if you have one non-binary person in your life, the burden is not on them to educate you. You are educating yourself to help enhance your relationship with them. There are many different gender neutral terms. It can really help to learn them. Like, for example, instead of just niece and nephew, nibbling is the new one. So nibbling is the gender neutral version of niece or nephew. So if you have a non-binary child of your sister, that would be your nibbling. And then instead of aunt or uncle, we have pibbling. These are really cute terms, so you should use them. So if your dad's sibling comes out as non-binary, they're your pibbling. Don't use dead names. A dead name is the name that somebody used before they changed their name. That's it. Please don't ask what somebody's name was before. And if you do somehow find out, please don't use it. Dead names, it can be very painful. It feels very invalidating. It feels unseen to be called by a dead name. So please don't. Also, please don't ask, what did you look like beforehand? What was your hair like beforehand? What did you wear for prom beforehand? I don't know, all that other stuff. For some people will be fine talking about it. And if they are, they'll bring it up first. So if somebody comes out to you as non-binary, or you find out they're non-binary, please don't ask what they were like beforehand, because if they're not comfortable, then, sorry, it's a little hard to describe. If they're not comfortable talking about it beforehand, it can kind of feel like you're valuing who they used to be instead of who they are now. So again, if somebody tells you openly, great. If they don't, please just move on. One's medical history is not your business. If somebody comes out to you as non-binary or as trans or some other gender, please don't ask about surgeries. Please don't ask about hormones. Please don't ask about what they were beforehand. If you are their primary care physician, please ask these questions. But in any other context, if you wouldn't ask a stranger on the street, hey, how did your surgery go? Please don't ask a non-binary transgender person that same question. Another part of etiquette, and this ties back into the education, is question your gender world. This is part of the gender robot test. Question how your world got to be gendered the way that it is. It wasn't an accident. Sorry, we have had some technical difficulties. Thank you for your patience. I am now ending the Jeopardy music, so let's continue. Okay, so I was at practicing. So the example that I gave is, if you're a big Star Trek fan, and if you talk about Lieutenant Data a lot, try using different pronouns when you talk about Lieutenant Data. You can say, I really like Lieutenant Data on this episode. They were so funny. I really appreciated their insights. And if you have pets and you talk to your pets a lot, use different pronouns for your pets. They don't know. They just appreciate the attention. So this is a great way to practice, is just do it on your own with people, pets, fictional characters who don't care. And I did talk about this before. Include your own pronouns, introductions, work signatures. If you're ever at any events where you wear the plastic or paper sticker name tag that says, hello, my name is whatever, put your pronouns on there. Even if you're cisgender, please put your pronouns on there, because again, when non-binary and transgender people are the only people putting pronouns, that automatically outs us, and not everybody wants to be outed. And then gender reveal parties. I'm not saying that people who do or attend or participate in gender reveal parties are bad people or wrong. I mean, if you want to do it, good for you, that's great. Who are transgender or intersex or non-binary, a gender reveal party is kind of a guess the baby's genitals party. Like, for example, I was recently adjacent to some people who were guessing To them, they were guessing the gender of a baby. And I was sitting there thinking, they're guessing a baby's genitals. I'm not going to say they're wrong or they're bad people. These are two very, very different perspectives. The part about gender reveal parties, if you don't know what a gender reveal party, that is when somebody's pregnant and there's a party where the genitals of the baby is revealed to everybody to say, we're going to have a baby with a vulva. Hooray, give us pink things. That's a gender reveal party. Up until the baby grows up and talks to you, you don't know the baby's gender. So the term gender reveal party, that's a misnomer. It is a genital reveal party. Like, that's what it is. Again, if you want to do it, that's great. I'm not saying you're wrong or you're bad. Just please don't be surprised when the transgender and non-binary people you know aren't very thrilled about being invited or talked to about the party. And then the last bit of etiquette, comprehension is not necessary for respect and acceptance. You might still be totally confused, and that's fine. It is confusing. If you'd never approached this topic before, if it's totally new to you, if you don't know what dysphoria or a binder is, yes, it is very confusing. Respect and acceptance don't require comprehension. I ask that you still just accept if somebody tells you my pronouns are they, them. Please respect that. Please accept it, even if you don't understand it. That is the bottom line. And then I did include, now the library, they have amazing resources here. They have a book display up over here. They have more programs coming up. There's the Pride Picnic, like there are wonderful library resources. I do have a couple other resources here. There's the Gender Wiki, Gender Wikipedia. This is kind of long. I don't know if you can see it. If you Google Gender Wiki, you'll get it. This is kind of a rabbit hole. Don't go there expecting a simple answer. Go there expecting to fall down the rabbit hole for a couple hours. If you were a kid and you wanted to look up a word in the dictionary, and when you got to the definition, there are so many words in the definition that you didn't know, so you had to look those up too to understand the first word. That's what Gender Wiki is like. You might want to have multiple tabs open to try to understand what's going on. And then there's this other very long one. It's a map of the world with many different genders that are not simply cisgender man, cisgender woman. This is just an interactive map of many different genders from around the world. If you just Google Two-Spirit map, it'll come up if this is too long for you. If you go to YouTube, there's the Queer Kids Stuff YouTube channel. This is extremely introductory, very simple, very basic gender and sexuality. It's just an incredible resource for people of all ages, really. Oh, that reminds me, non-binary, that's a gender. Non-binary people can be any and all sexualities. Those are separate. So I wanted to get that in there too. And then lastly, I did include my website because I do have a strong seminary and religious background. I'm not going to talk about it here because it's a public library, but I do have a resource list of non-binary spiritual and religious resources. It's on my website. Also, please feel free to contact me, email me, Facebook me, and so on if you have any questions. I'm always happy to answer and try to educate. And I think that's it. Yes. Question and answer time? Question is how to talk about Chaz Bono, Cher's child. So I actually read Chaz Bono's memoir. This was probably 10 years ago. And in the memoir, he refers to himself as he, son, transgender man. If Chaz has come out with some other gender or pronoun since then, I'm just not aware of it. But in the memoir, he is a transgender man and Cher's son. Okay, I don't know if anybody is familiar with the Quakers, the Society of Friends. They don't use those terms. They don't use my lord, like when they're in court in England, like that's one of the reasons why they left England, because they wouldn't refer to a judge as my lord. Sir, ma'am, my lord, these are all honorifics that people would say to someone who either owned land or was married to someone who owned land. Like, these are not common folk terms. These are class terms. And I know that we've kind of moved away from the class part. And I know that most people who are not Quakers or who have not hung out with Quakers probably aren't aware of that. Again, I think it's important to ask where these terms come from, because they didn't spring out of nowhere. They usually have some kind of class or even racial connotation to them. So I think in a situation like that, it might be good to ask the person maybe to do a little bit of research of where these terms come from to begin with, because terms are living things. They change over time. And a way to kind of lose their power over us is to learn where they came from to begin with. When it comes to honorifics, yes, there's sir, there's ma'am, there's also captain, doctor, reverend. I mean, of course, you can't really assume that an individual person is any of these things, but you also can't assume that someone is a sir or a ma'am. I think maybe if you just say please, or excuse me, or pardon me, that seems to be respectful enough. Usually just a very quick, oh, I'm sorry, correct pronoun, and then just move on. Thank you all for being here. And like I said, my website is kcreasel.com. It's my first name and my last name, and my email address and Facebook and all of that is on there. So if you have any more questions, please feel free to email, message, or whatever me at any time.